The purpose of this series is to provide an overview of select vintage and modern games, their pros and their cons, and what are the essential books and items that you need to play them. With different editions, multiple games appearing to be similar on the surface, and a huge variety of supplements and expansions, newcomers and even some veterans can often find it a daunting and confusing place to be. This series hopes to lend a helping hand. This time around, we are going to be talking about the various role-playing games that have specifically been set in the Marvel Universe. To that end, we won't be touching on generic superhero games that gamers have used to recreate Marvel characters with, or games that predominantly deal with other comic book publishers such as DC. Both of these, eventually, will get their own slots. Marvel's relationship with role-playing games, and even board games, has been a spotty affair, especially in recent times. But let us start our tale within the height of the second wave of role-playing games, when producing games under license for various franchises was the order of the day. This period saw games for books, such as Lord of the Rings, movie franchises, such as Star Wars and Indiana Jones, and, of course, comic books. As a fan of Ms. Marvel and the X-Men, as well as a gamer, I was excited when, in 1984, TSR released the Marvel Superheroes basic game. This game boiled down each hero's capabilities: fighting, agility, strength, endurance, reason, intuition, psyche, from which the system gets its PHASE-RIP acronym, and their powers into a general scale ranging from feeble to unearthly and beyond. This simple rating system translated into columns on a universal table. Attempting a strength feat? Find your strength rating column on the universal table, roll percentile dice, and receive a white, green, yellow, or red result. White means failure, with the other colours representing successes to greater degrees. Modifiers came in the form of column shifts. For example, if you have an excellent agility and receive a +1 column shift to a given roll, and then you roll 1 column up under remarkable. The game received an advanced set in 1986. The basic rules did include character generation to build your own heroes. Its main focus was, though, of course, showcasing the Marvel heroes and presenting them in a playable context. The advanced set pushed the generation rules, and while still presenting Marvel heroes and villains, more focus was given to players making their own superheroes up. Throughout its run, the Marvel Superheroes game received a fair number of supporting products: adventures, a wheel that packaged the universal table into a tool, supplements on teams such as the Avengers and the X-Men and so on. And for me, the highlight of these products was the 8-volume Gamer's Handbook of the Marvel Universe. Marvel themselves published the official handbook of the Marvel Universe in 15 volumes from 1982 to 1984. And TSR's Gamer's Handbook series followed the general scope of these, providing background and game statistics for many heroes and villains from Marvel Comics. The last products for the game were published in 1993, but the game was still available for a few years after that. When Wizards of the Coast bought TSR in 1997, they still had the license to produce role-playing game materials for Marvel characters. With the SAGA system in hand, Wizards published the Marvel Superheroes Adventure game in 1998, with a deck of cards, the Fate deck, used by SAGA system games, depicting several Marvel characters. The adventure game rules are very much simpler than the preceding role-playing game. Each hero has 4 primary statistics: strength, agility, intellect, and willpower, and 2 further statistics that affect play in more indirect ways: edge and hand size. Skills and powers are defined in a more narrative way, associated with a primary attribute where relevant. The game plays like a cross between a role-playing game and a card game. Players draw cards which have several attributes, including a suit matching a primary ability, and a value, Instead of rolling dice, players use the value of their attributes combined with the values of the cards that they play to perform a given action, with a further bonus should they use a card of the same suit as the attribute being used. An agility suit card when performing an agility action, for example. Combat works along the same lines, with a few complexities added to provide curveballs and strategy. It's a fun game to play, but it doesn't particularly feel like a role-playing game to me. More like a complex game of top trumps with some form of narrative built in. It was supported with various super team roster books and a handful of adventures. The game is nothing special, nor were any of the supplements, except perhaps the Guide to Marvel Earth, which is an interesting read. In any case, the license ended in 2000, and the Marvel Superheroes adventure game went out of print. A few years later, in 2003, Marvel themselves had a stab at producing a Marvel role-playing game in the form of the Marvel Universe role-playing game. This game attempted to represent the pages of a comic book, with timescales using comic terminology, so panels and pages and issues, for example. The game is a mixture of role-playing and resource management, the latter in the form of stones. In this case, literally stones, beads or markers or counters or whatever, to represent a character's capacity for action. How you assign stones to different parts of the character sheet during play describes your character's effectiveness in the actions it performs, in combat and powers and defence and so on. A few things stand out to me in this game. Firstly, the division of time into comic book terms is a great idea, and is more evocative than the Marvel Superheroes game Turns. Second, the resource management stones is annoying and cumbersome at the table. And finally, the rulebooks read as if the authors are desperate to put over that their game is completely different to any other game. They are mistaken. They introduce some good ideas for running superhero games, but they fumble things by making the game cumbersome and needlessly complex. While, I might add, by simultaneously saying that it's a really simple game, to which I say, really simple is represented in Marvel terms by the way that Wizards adapted the SAGA system, not by moving stones around all over the place. It is also unfortunate that they named the core of the Action Resolution System, giving focus to its acronym of ARSE. Anyway, the game sold reasonably, but not well. It received only a handful of supported volumes, all of which I have to say are well written, even if the rules let them down. But it all went out of print in 2004. The Marvel Universe game was barely around for a year. 8 years later, in 2012, Margaret Weis Productions gained the license for producing Marvel role-playing materials. This led to the publication of the Marvel Heroic role-playing game in 2012. The game draws from the Cortex system, which Margaret Weis Productions has used for many franchise-based role-playing games, including Serenity, Battlestar Galactica, Firefly, and Smallville. At its basic level, players assemble pools of dice drawn from their affiliation, important background elements known as distinctions, powers, specialities, and additional mechanical dice. After rolling, the pool is split into dice that serve to determine whether an action succeeds, and dice that determine the net effect of success. It's quite a simple mechanic that, by assigning different sizes of dice to represent different levels of power or expertise, avoids many of the complexities that can arise when modelling a broad range of superpowers within a role-playing game. In this, it is perhaps the easiest of the 4 games to manage. The affiliation is an interesting element that the other games don't consider, other than to state a particular hero has an affiliation to a particular group or team. Within Marvel Heroic, affiliation adds a die to the player's pool, and the size of the die is dependent on the circumstances the hero is acting under, alone or with an ally or as part of his team. Each hero has a different die size assigned to each of these 3, representing how well that hero operates within each circumstance. For example, Wolverine's solo affiliation die is a D10, his buddy die is a D6, and his team die is a D8. This means that Wolverine works best alone, but works well within his team. He is least effective when working with an ally. It's a neat touch that layers a game mechanic over aspects of a hero's personality. The game was supported through 2013 by a short series of supplements describing the Civil War event that had wrapped up in the comics 6 years before. However, Margaret Weis Productions did not renew their license, and so Marvel Heroic became the third post-Marvel superheroes game based in the Marvel Universe that had a woefully short life. What the future may hold for the Marvel Universe in games is anyone's guess, with the MCU in movies making ever greater headway. Perhaps the franchise is due another attempt. Or perhaps stalwarts of the superhero role-playing game genre, such as Mutants and Masterminds and Champions, with their capability to build any hero from any fictional universe, are in fact the bedrock of the genre within gaming, with no license required. The Marvel Superheroes role-playing game from TSR has apparently been a hard act to follow. It is a good game, as its decade-long existence attests, at least when compared to the longevity of the other Marvel role-playing games. It is still fun to play, has a mechanic that does not interrupt the flow of clobbering time, and is great for running both adventures and for laying out a couple of maps and having a superhero skirmish. However, the Marvel Heroic role-playing game just pips it in the most accessible way that it handles powers, and in the greater definition of character traits within the game's mechanics. Plot points add a resource strategy to the game, and the Doom Pool, a place where bad rolls go to add difficulty to a situation, or even trigger some superhero special effects should the referee's rolls contribute to it, is a fun addition to the gaming experience. The SAGA-based Marvel Superheroes adventure game is a fun game, but as I noted before, it suffers from feeling more like you are playing Magic with superheroes than going out and defeating Dr. Doom's latest scheme. Beyond the SAGA system, it doesn't really bring anything innovative to the table. Finally, the Marvel Universe role-playing game is a cumbersome mess. It suffers from a lack of playtesting or bad authorship or both. That being said, the use of comic book constructs such as panels and pages to define the action is a great idea. It's a shame that the arse of a system the game uses lets it down. So, for the quartet of Marvel licensed superhero games, I rank Margaret Weis Productions' Marvel Heroic as top dog, with TSR's Marvel Superheroes not far behind. Bringing up the rear are Wizards of the Coast's Marvel Superheroes adventure game, with Marvel's own Marvel Universe effort lagging on some distance behind. Oh, and please note that while I have assigned the Marvel Superheroes adventure game to Wizards of the Coast, I know it was released under the TSR name, when TSR was a subsidiary of Wizards prior to the brand being shelved. It has just made it easier to differentiate between the original TSR game and the SAGA game for the purposes of this review. And there we have it. Marvel's foray into role-playing games in a potted nutshell. There are a lot of superhero games out there that are still available and in print. Champions and Mutants and Masterminds we have already mentioned. There also have been several efforts to bring the DC universe to role-playing games, and several notable out-of-print games in the generic column, such as Games Workshop's Golden Heroes. While not as popular a genre as fantasy or science fiction in role-playing, the superhero genre is every bit as fun, and in some ways tailor-made for a team of players assembling to take on the bad guys. So why not give it a go, if you haven't already?